He gripped her wrist with blood-slick fingers and said the name like it weighed more than his own life. Noko. Then his eyes rolled back, and his chest stilled, and the last Lakota man she would ever meet in that part of Kansas died on her parlor floor. Clara hadn't meant to get involved. The wagon had come barreling into her pasture at dusk, one wheel cracked, two horses foaming and wild-eyed, and a Lakota man slumped in the driver's seat like death was already dragging him backward. She'd pulled him down by instinct, not mercy, and laid him on her floor, soaked his shirt with the last of her clean water, and watched him bleed through her good quilts like red ink on a Bible page. He hadn't begged, just said one name. Noko. Then gone. She didn't know what the name meant, man, place, tribe, warning, but it echoed in her ears even as she scrubbed the blood off her floor with shaking hands. Noko. It wasn't English, it wasn't hers, but it felt placed in her mouth for a reason she wasn't meant to understand. Just carry. And Clara Elkins had carried heavier things than names. Her husband had died in the fire at Laramie 2 winters ago, fighting over a sack of flour and a woman who wasn't his wife. Her son hadn't lived past birth. Her house, quiet and flame-scarred, stood now like a monument to a life that never quite arrived. So when a dying man whispered a final word into her hand, she didn't forget it. She buried him at sunrise beneath the cottonwood near the edge of the creek, wrapped in her father's old army coat. She carved no cross, left no marker, just a small leather strip with the name burnt into it, Noko. And then she packed. Her hands moved like they weren't her own, shoving food into sacks, wrapping blankets, tucking a borrowed pistol into her boot. She found herself whispering the name aloud, as if testing the shape of her own future. Noko. The air tasted different when she said it. Wilder. Older. She left at noon, the house still warm behind her. She didn't know where the road led, but she knew who she was going to find. She hadn't walked a full mile before the sky behind her turned black. Clara didn't look back at first, didn't want to believe it, but the smell hit her like a memory gone wrong. Smoke, sap, pine, and burning cotton. Her house was on fire. Whether it was lightning, vengeance, or something older than either, she couldn't say. But the place she'd buried the man, the place she'd started dying in long before she ever packed to leave. It was gone. A final push from the world, maybe. A clean burn to force her forward. Still, her knees buckled when the roof caved in from a distance, and she had to sit in the dirt, fist pressed to her mouth, watching the only place that had ever carried her last name disappear in crackling orange light. When she finally stood, she walked faster. Whatever Noko meant, it had taken root in her like a thorn she couldn't dig out. The word kept beating inside her, louder than her own breath, louder than the crack of burned wood behind her. By dusk, she'd reached the trader's post at 5 Willows. 3 horses were tied up outside. One was white, with red-stained reins. A boy no older than 10 was sweeping dust from the front step, his nose red from sunburn. He stared at her like she was either lost or dangerous. "You seen a man?" she said. "Lakota?" "Tall. Might have passed through with a wound." The boy kept sweeping. "We see lots of men," he mumbled. "Not like him," she said, and pulled the leather scrap from her pocket. "He said this name, before he died. Noko." The boy froze. His eyes darted to the back of the trading post. Then he dropped the broom and slipped inside without a word. Clara followed. Inside, 3 men were seated near a stove, playing cards. One of them looked up slowly, a tall man with braids and a scar beneath his eye. He saw the leather strip in her hand before she even spoke. "You got no business holding that," he said. "It was given," she replied. By a man who bled all over my floor to make sure I heard it." The man rose, taller than she expected. "Then you better come with me, because if he gave you that name, you just stepped into a fire bigger than you can put out." He led her out back through a gate made of antlers and driftwood, past crates of dry goods and smoked hide. The others didn't follow. They watched her leave like she was a message sent by a ghost. The man with the scar didn't speak until they reached the edge of a clearing where a single horse stood tied beneath a stripped cottonwood. "You know what Noko means?" he asked. Clara shook her head. "He said it like it was a person." "It is," the man said. "It's a name, but not just any name. Noko is what we call the one who listens when no one else does, the one who carries the stories that hurt too much to speak aloud." She stared at him, unsure if that was meant to answer her or deepen the riddle. "And who is he?" she asked. "Dead?" The man's lips twitched. "He's a boy. Or was. Taken from our camp by soldiers 4 years ago. No trace left, just his name whispered by dying men and mad ones. Now you show up holding it like it's yours." She clenched her jaw. "I didn't ask for it, but I buried the man who gave it to me. That counts for something." The man studied her. "What's your name?" "Clara Elkins, widow, Kansas." He gave a single nod. "I'm Tahu. And if you're telling the truth, Clara Elkins, then the one who gave you that name broke a promise he swore to his death." "What kind of promise?" she asked. "That no white hands would ever carry it again?" Her throat dried. "Why would he give it to me, then?" "Maybe because you're the only one who listened when he couldn't speak." Tahu turned and mounted his horse. "Get on. If you're holding that name, we ride. The child who bore it may still be alive. But if he is, he's in the hands of men who carve power from pain." "And where are we going?" Clara asked. "To the place where he vanished," Tahu said, voice flat. "And to the woman who made him forget who he was." Clara's pulse quickened. She didn't know what that meant, but she climbed up behind him anyway, clutching the saddle horn and the leather name like both might save her life. They rode for 3 days across hills that whispered when the wind shifted, through bone-dry canyons and shallow streams stained red by rust. Tahu didn't speak much, only pointed when they crossed a soldier's trail or dipped beneath burned cottonwoods. On the second night, they slept beneath the ribs of a dead wagon, its canvas torn and sagging like a memory. Clara asked once more about Noko, but Tahu only said, "Some names don't belong to the living." On the 3rd day, they reached the place. A mission school, long abandoned, its roof sagging inward, crosses carved into every stone like someone tried to bless rot. "They called it Mercy Place," Tahu said. "It was anything but." Clara stepped down from the horse, her boots sinking into dust. A row of charred fence posts ran along the edge of the property like crooked teeth. Tahu walked ahead, his eyes scanning for ghosts. "He was brought here?" she asked. "As a boy, with 3 others. One survived, the others disappeared. We thought he was dead. But last winter a man came out of the hills half-starved, speaking no words, only writing the name Noko in the dirt." Clara's skin prickled. "He came back?" "No," Tahu said. "He died 2 days later, but he left this." He pulled a chain from his pocket. At the end was a small gold cross, dulled and cracked. "It belonged to the woman who ran the place, the one Noko trusted, the one who—" He didn't finish, just handed her the cross. Clara turned it over. There were initials scratched on the back. "C.E." Her breath caught. "These are mine." "Then she wore something that belonged to you." "No," Clara said, heart hammering. "That's my mother's cross. She lost it during the war. It was all she had left of her father." Tahu stared at her. "Then maybe this story's bigger than just one name." Clara's hand closed around the cross, and something snapped inside her, recognition without understanding, like a dream from childhood returning in color. Where is she now? Gone, vanished when the school burned. No one's seen her since. But if she had this, Clara looked around the ruins. She knew me, or knew someone who did. The fire hadn't burned through all the roots. Something still lived here. Something waiting to be named. They found the cellar beneath a sheet of rusted tin and weeds. The door groaned as Tahu pried it open with a crowbar, the scent of old ash and mold curling up like breath from a grave. Clara descended first, her lantern casting wild shadows on stone walls. Shelves lined with broken jars, torn hymnals, and scorched rosaries framed the room like some forgotten altar. In the far corner, behind a splintered desk, she found the journal. Its cover was singed, the binding barely holding. Inside, pages of names, dozens, some crossed out, some trailed by a single word. Returned, rejected, taken, and there it was. Noko, reformed. What does that mean? She asked, holding it out to Tahu. He didn't answer, just stared at the word like it had cursed him. It means they stripped him of his language, he finally said, of his stories, his name. Reformed meant erased in places like this. Clara flipped the pages. At the end, tucked between the last entries, was a letter, written in a woman's hand. Sharp, elegant, every word pressed with purpose. To the one who finds this, I loved him. I tried. But love was not allowed here. They took him when they found us. Said I had turned savage. I took his pain and wore it like linen. But it still burned. If you are reading this, tell him. I did not forget. Tell him he was never wrong to speak the stars. No name signed. Just a pressed wildflower, brittle and yellow. Clara's chest felt hollow. She loved him, she whispered. And they punished them both. Tahu nodded. And now he walks without words, without memory, like a story half told. But he's alive? I think so, Tahu said. If he wasn't, no one would be hunting the name you carry. Clara's fingers trembled as she folded the letter. She didn't know how this woman had known her mother's name, her cross, her face. But it was no accident. The fire that took Noko's childhood had brushed her bloodline too. Then we find him, she said. We bring him the name back. Whole Tahu looked at her with something that might have been respect or warning. That name, he said, has burned stronger women than you. Then let it burn me, Clara answered. But let him remember who he is. They left the mission school before the sun reached its peak, riding hard toward the northern bluffs where the forest thickened and the soil turned red. Tahu said a scout had spotted men circling the hills, quiet riders who didn't wear uniforms but moved like they'd served. Clara kept the journal close, the woman's letter folded beneath her coat like a second heartbeat. They stopped at a creek to water the horses. Clara crouched to fill her canteen, but froze when she saw the reflection in the water. A man stood across the stream, half-shadowed by trees, wearing a faded blue army coat with brass buttons dulled by time. He didn't move, didn't raise a weapon, just stared at her like he knew her name. Tahu, she called without turning, but the man beat her to it. Clara Elkins, he said. His voice was quiet, rusted. You've got your mother's eyes. She stood slowly, her canteen forgotten. Who are you? Your uncle, he said. Thomas Elkins. Thought I died in Missouri, didn't you? You disappeared before I was born. No, he said. I was erased. Tahu stepped between them, hand on his knife. She doesn't need your ghosts. Neither do I, Thomas said. But they keep following me. He pointed to the journal tucked under Clara's arm. I left that for someone who still believed stories matter. I didn't think it'd be you. You were at the mission? She asked. Not as a soldier, he replied. As a teacher. before they turned it into something else. Then why did you leave? Because they made me choose, he said, between loyalty and love, and I chose wrong. Clara's pulse hammered in her throat. Did you know Noko? Thomas's mouth twitched. I knew the boy before he had that name. I knew the woman who gave it to him, too. Who was she? Clara asked. Was she family? No, he said softly. She was the only person who ever made me believe I wasn't meant to live alone. But they tore her away and buried him in silence. He took one step forward. But he's alive, Clara, and he's waiting. Where? She whispered. Thomas turned his face toward the ridge, where the fire started, and where it never really stopped. Then he vanished into the trees, like the past had simply stepped back into its hiding place. The wind turned colder as they reached the ridge, where black pines clawed at the sky and the ground grew soft with ash. Tahu rode ahead, but Clara felt every step of her horse like a drumbeat inside her chest. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no brush movement, just a stillness that smelled of memory. At the base of a rock outcrop, they found a cave half-collapsed, smoke curling faintly from within. Tahu dismounted first, motioned for silence. Clara followed, pistol ready, heart brittle. Inside, crouched near a dying fire, sat a boy of about 16. Skin the color of clay, hair long and tangled, eyes wild like something halfway between animal and dream. He didn't react to their presence. Not fearfully, not angrily, just stared at them like he couldn't decide if they were real. That's him, Tahu whispered. That's Noko. Clara stepped forward. Does he speak? Not since they took him. They beat the words out of him. But he writes, draws. The boy held a stick in his hand, slowly dragging it across a flat stone. Clara knelt beside him. On the stone was a spiral, unfinished, repeating, endless. My name's Clara, she said gently. Do you know this? She pulled the letter from her coat, placed the cross in his palm. His fingers closed around it like muscle memory. For a moment, his eyes flickered. Then he looked past her, toward the cave wall, and raised the stick again. He drew a shape, a woman's face with long hair and a scar across her lip. Clara gasped. It was her mother. He remembers, she whispered. He remembers her. Tahu crouched beside them. He remembers pain and protection. The two often come together. Footsteps cracked behind them. Thomas. He stood at the mouth of the cave, breathing hard. You need to move, he said. There are men coming. Not bounty hunters, not soldiers, worse. What do they want? Clara asked. Thomas looked at Noko. To finish what the fire started. He's not just a boy. They think he's a symbol, of defiance, of something they can't erase. Noko stood then, silent, holding the cross in one hand and the stone in the other. His gaze met Clara's. Not begging, not broken. Waiting. She knew in that moment. The fire wasn't just in the past. It was coming again. They came at twilight, silent as vultures, faces covered in soot and bandanas, their rifles low and steady like they'd already made peace with killing. 6 men, no insignias, no names, just a purpose carved into their silence. Finish what had once been buried beneath a chapel floor. Clara stood outside the cave, pistol clutched in both hands, while Tahu and Thomas took positions in the trees above. Noko stayed just inside, his back against stone, eyes wide but unshaking. The cross hung from his neck now, the string tied tight like armor. One of the riders dismounted. He didn't speak right away, just stared at Clara as if trying to place her among ghosts. Then, that name you carry, it's not yours. She didn't blink. He gave it to me. He doesn't have the right, the man said. He lost it when he stopped being one of us. He never was one of you, Clara snapped. He was a child, a sacred one, and you tried to burn him out of the world. The man cocked his head. You're braver than your bloodline. Then come find out how far that goes, she said. He raised his rifle. A shot rang out, but not his. From the ridge, Thomas fired first. The bullet struck the man clean in the shoulder, spinning him to the dirt. Chaos exploded. Tahu dropped one from the tree line. Clara ducked behind the rocks, firing blind. Horses screamed and scattered. 2 men fled. One dropped his weapon and crawled into the brush like a dying animal. Clara ran into the open before she could think, eyes locked on the boy in the cave. A figure loomed behind him. Another rider. This one hadn't fled. He had a knife drawn, moving toward Noko like the story was already over. No, Clara screamed. But before she could reach him, Noko turned. Fast. Without a word, he lifted the stone he'd drawn on and cracked it against the man's skull. Once. Then again. The man dropped. Noko stood above him, panting, stone dripping red, cross swinging from his neck like a bell. Clara froze. He looked at her, not for approval, for permission to still exist. She crossed the space slowly and touched his hand. You remember now? He nodded, eyes wet, and whispered, not in English but in Lakota. I am Noko. The name returned. They buried the dead in silence beneath the ridge, 6 shallow graves dug by hand, dirt packed down with boots and prayer. No ceremony. Just release. Thomas stayed behind after, standing at the edge of the clearing like a man watching his past sink into the soil. Tahu wrapped his arm, nodded once, and said no more. Clara and Noko sat beside the cave fire, the wind softer now, as if the earth had exhaled. He didn't speak much, still not in English, but every hour he seemed to regain another piece of himself. He drew constantly, smooth lines on bark and stone, images of buffalo and fire, a woman with long braids holding a sleeping child. Clara watched them take shape, each one a memory, each one a scar made visible. He remembers, she whispered. Tahu nodded. He was never lost, just waiting for someone to call him back by name. Clara glanced toward the ruined mission school far behind them, the journal still tucked inside her coat. The cross no longer dangled. She had given it to Noko, and he had braided it into a string of beads, worn proudly like a badge. Where will he go now? She asked. Tahu looked at her. Where would you want him to? The question sat heavy between them. Clara had come this far without knowing why, following a dying man's whisper, chasing smoke. But now, with nothing left behind, and everything ahead uncertain, she didn't want to let go. With me, she said finally, if he'll come. Noko looked up from his drawing. His eyes met hers, soft, steady, and he smiled. Not wide, not loud, but real. She reached out her hand. He didn't hesitate. That night they made camp beside the fire, Tahu guarding the tree line, Thomas already gone. Vanished into whatever penance waited for old men who loved too late. Clara wrapped Noko in her old shawl, the one her mother used to wear on Sundays, and whispered stories to him until he fell asleep, head resting on her lap. When the fire dimmed, she didn't sleep. She just listened, to crickets, to breath, to the quiet truth of belonging. He had a name again. And now, so did she. Not widow, not wanderer, not stranger, just the woman who walked into the fire and came out holding someone worth saving. Spring found them near the river fork, where willows bent low enough to touch the water, and Clara's voice finally sounded like it belonged outside again. Tahu left before the thaw, leaving only a carved figure of a bird for Noko, and a nod that carried more weight than a farewell. They built a shelter from cedar and traded at the edge of town, where no one asked questions if your hands were calloused and your coins were clean. Noko spoke more now, never many words, but always the right ones. He sang sometimes, too, soft Lakota melodies. Clara didn't know the meaning of, but could feel in her bones. One morning, as she washed their clothes by the river, he handed her a piece of bark. On it, a drawing of two figures beside a fire. One held a cross, the other held a child. Beneath it, carved carefully, were two names, his and hers. Not Clara, Noka, he'd written. She turned to him, puzzled. He smiled and placed a hand on her chest. Noka, he said again. Mother. Her throat tightened. No one had called her that in years, not even in dreams. She didn't answer, just pulled him into her arms and wept, quietly, into the shoulder of a boy who had survived fire and silence, and come back with his name. That evening, they cooked over an open flame, the smoke curling into the sky like a thread reconnecting something broken. Noko added one more bead to his necklace. Their old house key, blackened from the fire, the last thing she'd carried from the past. Why keep it? He asked softly. She shrugged. To remember what I lost. He held it up, studied it. Or what led you here. The next morning they planted a cottonwood beside their new cabin. The soil was soft and rich. Noko carved words into the bark in both Lakota and English. One name for her, one for him. And beneath them, a single phrase. The fire did not end us. Clara stood back, hand shading her eyes from the sun. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was walking toward something unfinished. She had arrived. Please like, share, and subscribe for more true-hearted tales here on Echoes of the West. If you'd followed a dying man's whisper into a burning past, would you have stayed when you found the boy? Tell us in the comments.